If you like what I do, consider joining my channel or donating to my coffee. Links in the description. The developers of Cookie Cutter have recently dropped the announcement that their game is finally coming to the Switch along with a bevy of updates, such as a bunch of improved combat mechanics, new cutscenes, voice acting for the entire game, and a whole lot of other stuff. I'm just going to throw it up on the screen for you to peruse at your leisure. Like I said, it's a lot. With such a substantial update, I figured, why not finally talk about Cookie Cutter? And so, here we are, with a Cookie Cutter video. Finally talking about Cookie Cutter. I really don't know how to prepare you for this. There aren't many games quite like Cookie Cutter. I'm not just talking about its over-the-top violence, characters with filthy mouths, and the talking vagina. Okay, maybe it's a little about the talking vagina. So, what is Cookie Cutter? It's a blood-soaked, punk-fueled Metroidvania that throws you into the hyper-violent sci-fi dystopia of the megastructure. You play as Cherry, an android or Denzel, on a revenge mission to rescue her creator/lover. Which is kind of weird, right? Aren't they like mother-daughter? Gross. Anyway, after experiencing one of the most brutal intros to a game ever, Cherry resolves to smash everything in her way to rescuing her girl, all while sporting a "I'm too cool for you" attitude. The game's fast, stylish, and unapologetically chaotic. But is all this punk rock attitude backed up by solid gameplay, or is it just a bloody mess?
Combat.
If Guacamelee and No More Heroes had a baby, then threw that baby into a vat of neon blood and rage, you'd get Cookie Cutter. What is wrong with me? This game is loud and violent. Cookie Cutter is all about brutal, up-close melee combat that involves ripping and tearing enemies apart with her fists, chainsaws, and, of course, a guitar. Combat's a fluid mix of crunchy, weighty attacks, flashy combos, and satisfyingly violent finishers. At its core, everything that has to do with combat revolves around the void. No, not that void. You build up void with your weak light attacks, and use accumulated void for your heavy attacks, special moves, and healing. Using void for healing is interesting, as the conversion from void to HP is 1-to-1, meaning healing is a real-time commitment. So, healing during combat can be a little tricky. I honestly didn't dig Cookie Cutter's combat initially, but it eventually grew on me. My issue in the beginning was just how weak Cherry's light attacks are. To do any real damage, you gotta hit with Cherry's slower heavy attacks. And these attacks require void to use. But to get void, you have to hit enemies with the quicker, much weaker light attacks. This creates an interesting synergy between light and heavy attacks that took me a minute to actually appreciate. But once I got the hang of void management, I thought it was a pretty unique system that made for some good combat. But this void management is really what's going to make or break Cookie Cutter's combat for players. Having one resource responsible for damage, healing, and special attacks is pretty demanding, especially with how slow healing is. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with this void management economy, as its restricting design is very intentional, and it's what makes Cookie Cutter's combat uniquely Cookie Cutter. Just know that it comes with a learning curve, and as with anything that comes with a learning curve, it's going to be difficult to pick up at first. At least it was for me, because I wanted to run in and pummel everything with quick weak attacks. I mean, if you wanted to, you could do that the entire game, but with weak attacks alone, it takes you a very long time to even take out the most basic of basic enemies. So the sooner you grasp void management, the better. And once I embraced the void, Cookie Cutter's combat clicked. But not everything about Cherry's combat clicked. I love how she has access to a bunch of different weapons for her heavy attacks, and switching weapons is as easy as holding down a button and choosing your instrument of destruction. Though not so simple that you could switch weapons mid-combo. This was all well and good, but it was the special moves you could switch up in this menu that I found limiting. Cherry gets like 6 special moves throughout the game, given you find them all, but she can only have one equipped at a time. Considering that some of these moves are necessary for traversal and overcoming ability gates, it could be a hassle to switch them. It's not a big deal, but it was a little obnoxious, especially when I forgot to switch back to the devastating super move for the boss fight. But Cherry isn't all about offense. She starts with an evasive roll, a parry, and eventually gets an air dash for some aerial evasion. I personally didn't find the parry to be very responsive. There were some enemies I could parry pretty well, but if I missed one parry against them, I just couldn't get a parry off no matter how hard I tried. Could be a technical issue, but it could also be a skill issue because I'm just awful at parrying. You can let me know how your parrying experience was in the comments. I stopped parrying altogether eventually, though there is one boss about mid-game that almost requires you to parry him in order to win. And if you do get 4 or 5 parries on him, it breaks down his yellow poise bar. And when that bar is depleted, whether you're a boss or a regular enemy, Cherry gets to brutalize them. Not only are these executions over-the-top spectacles that finish off your foes, but brutalized enemies also drop a bunch of void spheres that greatly replenish your void. You know, the stuff you use for everything in combat in this game. But you don't need to master the parry to brutalize your enemies. Just weakening them will bring up the brutalization prompt. And don't you worry, you'll have plenty of opportunities to brutalize your enemies because the game likes to lock Cherry in arena battles and throw waves of enemies at her. I know some people don't like arena battles in their MVs, but I never minded them. And Cookie Cutter does that thing from Guacamelee where it gives you something to bust open after clearing the room, and I like being rewarded for all my brutalizing. Makes me feel appreciated. Something I found more fun than brutalizing my enemies was bullying them with the Void Hand. It's basically a pink arm Cherry summons to punch. It's used for a few puzzles in the game, but I mostly used it to punch enemies in the traps for some easy kills and hours of fun. Cookie Cutter's bosses are okay. Other than the boss I showcased during the parry discussion, none of the other bosses really stand out. Even the final boss was just okay. There was this flying boss that had an interesting arena to fight in, but most bosses were really just beefed up regular enemies. In fact, a couple of them actually do become regular enemies down the line. Just stick and move until you get to brutalize them. The bosses looked pretty cool though, and their animations were fantastic. Just don't expect to be challenged by them. Except for the parry one, he was tough. That's it for combat. Cookie Cutter delivers an intense, fast-paced combat system that rewards aggression, strategy, and smart void management. While the learning curve might be steep, especially when balancing light attacks, void consumption, and healing, the combat becomes incredibly satisfying once it clicks. The ability to swap between heavy weapons and special moves adds variety, though the restriction of equipping only one special move at a time can be a bit limiting. Arena fights are frequent but rewarding, and brutalizing enemies never gets old. Boss battles, while visually impressive, don't quite do enough to differentiate themselves from the moment-to-moment combat. Still, between the sheer spectacle, the crunchy attacks, and the over-the-top finishers, Cookie Cutter's combat offers a bloody good time.
Abilities. Platforming.
Cherry's abilities range from your standard MV affair to something truly unique. As far as standards go, she gets the double jump, air dash, wall jump, and ground pound. Her really cool ability is called the slingshot, and it lets her fly. Well, maybe not fly, more like fling herself through the air with style. It's a cool move, especially as a damaging approach in combat, but it has a couple of weaknesses as a traversal skill. It requires a ridiculous amount of void to pull off, so you can't really do it more than 2 or 3 times unless there's a trail of void spheres to fling yourself into. But the worst part is you get it so late in the game. In fact, so much cool stuff is introduced way too late in the game. The game's coolest traversal ability, the game's most unique weapon, and a game-spanning quest about collecting monster parts that gets introduced like an hour before the game ends. I'm already at the finish line, bro. I don't feel like backtracking for materials at this point. A quest of that magnitude would have been more impactful if introduced near the beginning of the game. Anyway, getting back to abilities, getting a game's coolest and most interesting ability in the late game is nothing new to Metroidvanias. Heck, sometimes getting the coolest ability late works really well, typically if obtaining it late is related to the narrative. But personally, I always find making the game's most interesting ability available sooner rather than later creates a more memorable and better player experience. Again, that's not always the case, but devs shouldn't be afraid to let players play with their coolest features sooner. I know that affects level design and progression, so consider it food for thought. To wrap up abilities, Cookie Cutter also has some utility gating that can only be overcome by certain weapons, with one utility overcoming weapon being locked behind an incorrectly presumed side quest. And I gotta say, I love when traversal abilities are obtained through means other than stand on this upgrade platform or defeat this boss. I also love when these abilities double as combat options, as you would assume weapons would. But pulling double duty also extends to traversal abilities that count as super moves, like the slingshot and the ground pound. As for platforming, it's alright. Nothing really sticks out as either exceptional or weak. There's lots of traps and hazards, but there weren't any platforming segments that busted my chops too badly. Well, there was one section near the end that involved platforms, wall jumping, and a shit ton of spikes that took me a few tries. And there were a few interesting sections with a slingshot that you could only experience after backtracking. There were some light puzzles in the game that required you to punch orbs into a machine with your void hand. I found these sections to be fun and rewarding and not too difficult. Biomes didn't have too many gimmicks. Each had their own unique environmental hazards, and one biome was super dark and required you to turn on the power before entering certain sections. But by and large, there really wasn't a lot of gimmicks to play with throughout Cherry's journey. That's it for this section. Cookie Cutter offers a solid mix of standard and unique traversal abilities, but its pacing holds back some of its best mechanics. The late introduction of its most unique features, like the slingshot, feels like a missed opportunity, limiting the time players have to fully enjoy them. That said, the game does a great job of integrating weapons and abilities into both combat and traversal, making upgrades feel meaningful. Platforming is serviceable, with some tricky sections and light puzzle solving, but nothing too groundbreaking. A few more bio-specific gimmicks could have added variety, but as it stands, traversal gets the job done without stealing the spotlight from what the game is truly about: combat and brutalizing mutants and robots.
Progression.
Cookie Cutter is very much a Metroid-like, as every upgrade Cherry gets is gotten through things you find through exploration. There are no leveling or skill trees here, the latter's absence being mildly disappointing for such a combat-focused game. With 5 different heavy weapons to wield and a basic light attack combo, you'd hope for some kind of progression system that gave Cherry new attacks via a skill tree. And though her light attacks don't evolve outside of using components, more on those in a sec, heavy attack weapons can get new moves through a crafting system. So it's not like Cherry's moveset doesn't increase or evolve over time. It's just a little non-traditional, and I can respect that. Though, I would have really liked more options and moves for Cherry's light attacks. Crafting in Cookie Cutter is exactly what you're thinking. Find materials from fallen enemies or chests and take them to an NPC. Drop some cash, and boom, you got a stronger weapon. It's a simple yet effective system we've all grown to appreciate. And gathering cash, or bits, is as simple as destroying stuff in the environment or destroying your enemies. Does this guy look like he cares where you got the cash? There's a few shops in the game's hub town called the Hidden Diner. Here, you'll eventually find people to upgrade your weapons, sell you crafting materials, and enhance your components. Components are Cookie Cutter's accessories and comprise the game's character modification system. I know that's a mouthful, but I just don't want to use Hollow Knight's charm system as a reference anymore. Anyway, components do all kinds of things, such as increasing your max HP, your max void, and giving Cherry 2 aerial uppercuts. Each component comes with an energy value, and Cherry only has so much energy, which limits how many components she can equip. And of course, you can increase Cherry's max energy by finding energy cells, which in turn allows you to equip more components. Most components and energy cells are found in chests as you explore and are typically locked behind optional platforming challenges or puzzles. And as you can imagine, finding these was always a treat. Cookie Cutter does have a few side quests, but they're mostly fetch quests. Find this thing and take it to this guy kind of affairs. Or, in Phobie-Tox's case, find all the things and take it to this guy. There is a side quest that requires you to find things and take it to a robot lady who will reward you with exposition and flashbacks, and that's always cool in my book. That's it for progression. Cookie Cutter takes a straightforward, exploration-driven approach to progression with no leveling or skill trees, but plenty of upgrades to find. While the lack of expanded light attack combos is a bit disappointing, the crafting system and component customization provide solid ways to evolve Cherry's abilities. Hidden upgrades feel rewarding to discover, and the game's hub town offers a variety of useful shops. Side quests are mostly simple fetch quests, but one NPC adds meaningful lore. Overall, the game's progression is a solid system that prioritizes exploration over grinding, though a deeper combat progression could have made it even better, considering the game is so combat focused.
Exploration.
Exploration in Cookie Cutter is fun for an unexpected reason. Though the biomes are interesting and there are rewarding things to find throughout your journey, I had a lot of fun just destroying everything in my path. There are so many destructible objects in this game, and I feel we take that for granted in our Metroidvanias. Destructible objects make backtracking a little less tedious, and I appreciate that. I also loved all the game's Easter eggs. Video game references, manga references, cartoon references, music references. There's a reference to West Borland in this game. Like, of all people, Limp Bizkit's West Borland. Don't get me wrong, I loved Wes back in middle school and even followed Big Dumbface. And I think that's what appealed to me the most in this game. With all the Offspring and NoFX and Tool throwbacks, I was transported back to simpler times. It's clear to see the devs wanted to pay homage to all that's inspired them, and I dig when devs wear their passion on their sleeves. But let's get into exploration proper. Is Cookie Cutter's exploration rewarding? I'd say that's an easy yes. Besides the fun Easter eggs, you can find money, crafting material, components, energy cells, weapons, and items to unlock flashbacks. There's also a lot of logs you can find to get a better understanding of the game's world. The biomes look nice and varied. You got the dark pit, a poison swamp, a few industrial looking places, and they tend to interconnect in interesting ways, though some of these connections aren't always meaningful, but it's cool they connect nonetheless. The in-game map is pretty nice, though it did erase my progress every once in a while, and I wasn't sure why. Sometimes just some areas would get erased, sometimes it was an entire map. This was a huge issue, and I hope the devs get that figured out for their Switch release and huge patch coming up. That unpleasantness aside, the map pulls a lot of weight and is fairly dummy-proof. It labels all points of interest automatically, such as chests and your current objective and places where certain abilities are needed to progress. And it keeps track of all the collectibles in the area so you can see what still needs to be found. I honestly don't prefer dummy-proof maps, but I also don't mind them. However, I know a lot of people who do not like dummy-proof maps, so I thought I'd mention it. Cookie Cutter is largely a linear experience, but it does have you retrace your steps a couple of times in order to find entrances to other biomes that were originally inaccessible. And I really like when MVs make backtracking a necessity for the critical path. Speaking of backtracking, backtracking is mostly painless thanks to Cookie Cutter's fast travel system. It's a waypoint system with specific travel points, and I really didn't have an issue with their placement as each waypoint felt like it was close enough to points of interest. And though backtracking is necessary in this game to progress, the majority of backtracking will be to discover chests and other items. So if you don't want to backtrack, I guess you don't have to too much, but you'll be missing out on some sweet enhancements. And that's it for exploration. Cookie Cutter makes exploration engaging not just through its biomes and secrets, but through the sheer joy of destruction. Smashing your way through the world makes even backtracking feel satisfying, and the game's many Easter eggs add an extra layer of fun. The map is highly functional, though some may find it a bit too handholdy, and despite some frustrating bugs, it makes navigation easy. While the game is largely linear, its interconnected world and solid fast travel system make retracing your steps worthwhile. If you take the time to explore, you'll be rewarded with powerful upgrades, cool lore, and plenty of nostalgic nods.
Atmosphere. Narrative.
Cookie Cutter's visuals are its most striking attribute and are often compared to Grindhouse comics and the hyper-stylized worlds of games like No More Heroes and Guilty Gear. Its art style is loud and raw, featuring over-the-top character designs, excessive gore, and high-contrast colors that give the game a rebellious, underground comic book feel. The animation style also gets praised for its fluidity and intensity, further emphasizing the game's brutal, high-energy combat. To me, the character designs and especially animations are reminiscent to early to mid-90s cartoons, reminding me of shows like Ren and Stimpy. Anytime Salem Garbanzos popped up on a screen, I got heavy, early MTV animation vibes like it was something from Liquid Television. And with how reference-heavy this game is, I wouldn't be surprised if these homages aren't intentional. And I love the game for it. There's a lot about this game's aesthetics that hit for me. I'd suspect the person responsible for the game's art and I would have a lot in common when it came to media consumption in our formative years and throughout high school. Punk, counterculture, and irreverence is the raison d'etre for Cookie Cutter, and it's definitely something I dig. When it came to Cookie Cutter's music, I was a little surprised. Considering all the punk, underground, and alt-rock Easter eggs in the game's holistically punk aesthetic, I was looking forward to some discordant, underproduced DIY punk soundscapes and maybe a little metal. But instead, I got a lot of mid-energy butt rock with some industrial-sounding tracks. None of it sounded bad, it just wasn't what I expected. And that's on me. I expected tracks that sounded like something from Bikini Kill or The Raincoats or whatever cat from 10 Things I Hate About You would listen to. R.I.P. Heath Ledger. On the narrative side of things, I guess I have a few things to say. I already made a jab at the mother-daughter-to-lovers angle being a little weird, but you really can't go wrong with the saving the girl motivation for your main character. And they set up Salem Garbanzos as a pretty nasty dude from Jump Street while reinforcing his nastiness by having him taunt Cherry throughout the game. Regardless, I still wanted to see more of Garbanzo's mayhem. Logs talk about how shitty life on the megastructure is, and how the Garbanzos are capitalist pigs who treat citizens literally as disposable tools, and how the proletariat must rise to take down the bourgeoisie, and blah blah blah. The same counterculture and punk tropes and cliches I've been eating up since I was a wee lad. It's a fine setup, but I just wanted to see more of it. Cookie Cutter's world is big, but it feels very empty and not lived in, which I guess is the point, as many of the biomes are industrial centers and or inhospitable to human life. But then there's Bastardville right before the end of the game, full of life and interesting characters. Here, you'll meet a brand new important character and a rebel army ready to siege Garbanzo's Golden Tower. This is what I wanted from Cookie Cutter. This is what the game needed. More relationships to build and a big set piece to make the stakes feel high. Of course, wanting to save your mom/girlfriend is important, but taking down an evil regime with the help of your new rebel forces is far more interesting. So when Cherry unites with Punani, I swear that's a character's name, you're like, okay, shit's about to get real. And I'm gonna stop there because I'm getting too close to spoiling things. So, let's ask the question, is Cookie Cutter's narrative good? I mean, I dug it eventually. I'm actually not the biggest fan of the game's swear-heavy dialogue or Cherry's I'm too cool for you attitude. And I didn't really connect to its world until I got to Bastardville. There's something about seeing a town full of NPCs who are reinforcing the world building. It just injected new life into the game for me. I really wish Bastardville had been introduced and integrated into the game much sooner. Seeing a more prolonged and involved relationship between Cherry and Punani as they played off one another to gradually earn each other's trust would have gone a long way in immersing me in this world. I know working for someone else and following someone else's rules isn't Cherry's style, but that's kind of the point. Is Cherry able to set aside her I'm cooler than you attitude and humble herself enough to play by someone else's rules if it means getting back the one she loves? Maybe she can, maybe she can't. That's called conflict, my friends, and it's the thing that makes stories go round. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. That's just me musing like a madman. I guess I'll end this section by saying the story didn't jibe with me at first, but it did get me interested in the end. If DLC or a sequel is announced, I'd get it day one just to see where the story goes next as the game ends on a massive cliffhanger. It's kinda rude, really.
Final thoughts and score.
Cookie Cutter is a wild, hyper-stylized, and brutally fun ride that oozes personality. Its intense, fast-paced combat rewards aggression and smart void management, while the game's punk rock aesthetic and vibrant animation make it visually unforgettable. The platforming and exploration are solid, if not groundbreaking, and the progression system, while lacking true enhancements to your light attack game, still provides meaningful upgrades. The late game introduction of some of the best mechanics feels like a missed opportunity, and the story takes a while to fully engage, but once it does, it delivers a satisfying, rebellious journey. Despite some pacing issues and minor frustrations, Cookie Cutter stands out as a unique and stylish Metroidvania that isn't afraid to do its own thing. I award Cookie Cutter a 7.5 out of 10. Cookie Cutter is on PC and all major consoles with a Switch release scheduled for March 27th, 2025. I played the game exclusively on the Steam Deck with 0 issues, and thus give the game a Steam Deck rating of verified.
Pair placement.
Cookie Cutter is a bold, bloody, and stylish Metroidvania with jaw-dropping visuals and rewarding exploration that delivers an interesting combat hook with its focus on void management. While its sheer personality and high-energy action make it a standout experience, the game suffers from a lack of a deeper combat progression system and slow pacing, forcing most of the game's coolest and most fun aspects in the game's final couple of hours. Regardless, fans of brutal melee combat and punk rock aesthetics will find plenty to love, even if some design choices might not click with everyone. Cookie Cutter's vagina talks its way into the B tier. Oh, 15 takes, and that's the best one. The stupidest line I ever said. I get Cookie Cutter's vulgarity isn't going to be for everyone, but if you're able to look past its irreverence, you'll find there's a lot to love. And there's a lot of untapped potential yet to be tapped. With the Overkill Edition releasing soon with all its improvements, I'm eager to jump back into the megastructure to experience the improvements myself. I know what you're thinking. Why not wait to play through the Overkill Edition before doing a Cookie Cutter video? Simple. Because I wanted to document how the game was before the update. I fully plan on creating a Metroidvania Revisited episode on the Overkill Edition. So, stay tuned, because I'm really hoping the update will make the game a cut above the rest. What? You're gonna boo me for that? You know how hard it was for me to not do a vagina pun? That's what I thought. You're welcome.